I want to tell you a story about the pre-colonial Filipinos and the secret book that prove they were living in a golden age long before the world knew their names. For hundreds of years, the history of the Philippines was told through the eyes of others. But in 1947, a manuscript called the Boxer Codex was rediscovered. It contains vibrant paintings of the people we now call Filipinos, specifically the Tagalogs and Visayans, dressed in heavy gold and fine silks. When you look at these pages, you aren't just seeing random figures. You are seeing a highly civilized society that existed in 1590. The men and women in these drawings were royalty and warriors who ruled organized states with their own laws and complex trade routes. One Spanish observer wrote in the book that the people of these islands wear more gold than any other nation in the world. This was a dangerous truth because it showed that these people were not waiting to be discovered. They were already masters of their own destiny. Another entry describes their sophisticated culture by saying, their laws are respected and their trade reaches every corner of the sea. By identifying these figures as the ancestors of the Filipino people, we realize that their history was intentionally downplayed for centuries. As one modern researcher noted, this manuscript is the most important window into the soul of the pre-colonial world. Today, we look at the Boxer Codex not just as art, but as a birth certificate for a nation that was wealthy and powerful long before the first explorer arrived. History is often written by the winners. But sometimes, those winners leave behind a receipt they never expected anyone to read closely. For centuries, many Filipinos were told that before the Spanish arrived, there was nothing here but scattered, uncivilized tribes living in the dark. That story is not just incomplete, it's deeply misleading. And one of the clearest pieces of evidence against it is a remarkable 16th century manuscript called the Boxer Codex. The Boxer Codex is basically a field guide created in the late 1500s by Spanish colonial officials in Manila. It contains detailed descriptions and more than 75 full-color illustrations of the peoples of the Philippines and neighboring regions in Southeast and East Asia. Instead of showing a land with nothing worth mentioning, its pages reveal societies with hierarchy, wealth, trade connections, and a strong sense of identity. For a long time, this manuscript lived quietly in private hands in Europe. In the 20th century, it ended up in a British noble family's library, survived bomb damage during World War II, and was finally sold at auction in 1947 when historian Charles R. Boxer bought it. That's why we now call it the Boxer Codex. From there, scholars began to study it more seriously, and today it's preserved in a university library in the United States, helping us reimagine what the pre-Hispanic Philippines actually looked like. When you open the Codex, you don't see a dark and backward land. You see elites draped in gold, wearing layered textiles and carrying prestige weapons. You see organized communities with clear social ranks and connections to a wider Asian trading world. The people drawn in these pages are not waiting to be saved. They are already playing their own roles in a very busy regional network. One of the most striking groups in the Codex is the Visayan people, often called the Pintados by the Spanish because of their tattoos. These tattoos weren't random decoration. Early accounts describe them as marks of courage and achievement, earned in battle in important life events. Imagine your entire body as a living record of what you've survived and accomplished, every line a story, every pattern a receipt of bravery. The Codex and related accounts describe Visayan elites wearing impressive amounts of gold, chains around the neck, bracelets on the arms, ornaments hanging from the ears and hair. There are historical descriptions of gold being so common in some communities that outsiders were amazed by it. This wasn't just a trinket here and there. This was a whole visual language of status made from precious metal. This is a far cry from the stereotype of people waiting to be civilized. Many Visayans and other lowland groups already lived in settled communities with leaders, warriors, artisans, and traders. Their appearance in the Codex, tattooed, armed, and covered in jewelry, shows that the Spanish encountered societies that were already confident in who they were. Another reveal from the wider historical record around the Codex is the role of women, especially spiritual leaders known as the Babaylan in many communities. These women, and sometimes men in a gender non-conforming role, acted as priests, healers, and ritual specialists. They conducted ceremonies, interpreted signs, and influenced important decisions. In other words, spiritual and social authority didn't just flow through men, and that alone would have challenged the European worldview at the time. This clash of worldviews helps explain why colonial powers later tried so hard to sideline or demonize these figures. A woman leading rituals and guiding the community did not fit the patriarchal model that the colonizers wanted to impose. Attacking the Babaylan and replacing them with missionaries was not just about religion. It was about rearranging power. The Codex's depictions of Tagalog and other lowland elites add another layer. In those images, you see the people in fine woven textiles, some likely imported, paired with jewelry and carefully styled hair. They look composed, self-possessed, and very aware of their own status. This visual record matches what we know from other sources. Long before Spain, local leaders were trading with China, Japan, and kingdoms like Siam in mainland Southeast Asia. That means when the first Spanish ships appeared on the horizon, they were not discovering an isolated world. They were entering existing networks of trade and diplomacy. Porcelain, silk, metalwork, and other goods were already flowing through Philippine ports. Local rulers were already negotiating alliances, tribute, and marriage ties long before Europe entered the picture. The pattern that emerges from the Codex and related accounts is clear. These communities had complex social structures, customary laws, and economic systems. Leaders collected tribute. Disputes were settled through recognized procedures. There were rules about debt, marriage, inheritance, and punishment. The details varied by region, but the core point is that order and law existed before any European governor landed in Manila. You also see evidence of everyday sophistication in small but telling details like hygiene and literacy. Early Spanish observers remarked that many indigenous people bathed frequently and cared about cleanliness, sometimes more than the Europeans themselves. They also encountered local scripts, syllabaries used by Tagalog, Kapampangan, and other groups to write letters, record transactions, and inscribe names. This is an important reminder that writing did not arrive with the Spanish. A form of writing was already here. Now, does the Boxer Codex read like a modern anti-colonial manifesto? No, it was created by and for colonial officials, and it carries all the bias that comes with that. The artists and writers often exoticize and stereotype the people they depict. They categorize and label entire groups based on appearance, religion, and usefulness to the empire. But that's exactly what makes the Codex so powerful today. It's like a confession that slipped through the cracks. Even while trying to classify and control the people they met, the authors could not avoid recording their wealth, their organization, and their confidence. In trying to describe a world they wanted to dominate, they accidentally preserved proof that this world already stood on its own terms. For generations, however, Filipino students were often taught a flattened version of this story. The focus was on colonizers brought Christianity, brought government, brought education, as if nothing meaningful existed before them. The richness of the pre-colonial period, its gold, its trade networks, its spiritual leaders, its writing systems was pushed to the margins or reduced to a few paragraphs. That's why the Boxer Codex matters so much today. It doesn't show a perfect utopian past. It shows a human past, complicated, unequal in its own ways, but undeniably alive and connected. It shows ancestors who were not blank slates waiting for someone else's civilization, but explorers, warriors, artisans, traders, and ritual specialists shaping their world. You could say the Codex is a time machine made of ink and paper. When you look at those illustrations, the tattoos, the textiles, the gold, you are looking straight at a set of truths that later narratives tried to bury. The darkness was never in the islands themselves. The darkness was in the way the story was told. And now that we can read this receipt for ourselves, we don't have to accept the old script anymore. The past wasn't empty. It wasn't waiting. It wasn't dark. It was already lifted up with color, with courage, and very literally with gold.